Hi everyone, and welcome to a Sociology of Media Voices series. Today, we have the absolute privilege of speaking to someone who's making a difference in their Indigenous community, and they are Devon Cuimara. They are founder and CEO. Their desire was to establish an Aboriginal Male Healing Centre, comes from seeing violence in his own family and in his Aboriginal community in general. He states that it goes back to his father and his grandfather, where there were generations when police wouldn't worry about a complaint from a woman. It was something that was seen and not heard, like we were as children. He states that he has to protect his mother, he had to protect his brother and sister and himself. He was his father's keeper. He left an abusive home and started abusing his partner, who's now his former partner, until he managed to change his way over 20 years ago. His attempts to use mainstream rehabilitation services fell flat, so he worked through the issues himself through a process of deep reflection, and what he discovered was that the answers laid in his own cultural roots. Devon will be speaking to us today about the Aboriginal Males Healing Centre, Strong Spirit, Strong Families, Strong Culture Incorporated, which is an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, registered charity providing culturally appropriate family violence services to Aboriginal people. The service is located and operated in the Shire of East Pilbara, Western Australia. The Aboriginal Males Healing Centre, Strong Spirit, Strong Family, Strong Culture, was first incorporated in 2015 and began working in 2018. The vision is that all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children live safe and healthy lives free from family violence and homelessness as a result. In addition, the centre aims to reduce the overrepresentation of First Nation men incarcerated for their use of violence. I would now like to take this opportunity to welcome a real hero in our community. Wow, so here we are, everyone. Now it's over to Devon to tell us a little bit about Devon, where he's from, and the wonderful space that is in the west of Australia. Good morning, Devon.
Good morning, Ricky. How are you?
Not too bad. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Devon.
Right. Okay. A little bit about myself. Well, I'm from a Noongar man, or First Nations man, from Western Australia, southwest of Western Australia to be precise. I note that when we were in our pre-discussions, I suppose, regarding the intro and what we need to do to lay down our format for the interview today, that you mentioned you were a member of the stolen generation, and likewise I resonate with that. I'm also a member of the stolen generation, and indirectly a member also. Both sides of my great-grandparents were removed from their parents, so we've gone 2 generations now without with that trauma. We live with that traumatic trauma. All First Nations people do. and anybody that's experienced any form of trauma really, carries that burden of intergenerational trauma. And it's one of those debilitating sicknesses we have in our community, is the psychosocial disabilities that, our people confront in all of our communities in our First Nations, communities around Australia. It's a so my father is Yamadi. It's one of the tribes over here. It's more into the Gascoyne region my father's from, and his family. And my mother is Noongar, which is the southern tip, I suppose, of Western Australia. Not too dissimilar to the East Coast brothers and sisters in the geographical layout, except that we have the vast expanses of nothingness, really, which is a blessing and a curse, to be quite honest, because they get away with a lot more over here in WA than what they would on the East Coast, with the recognition of the wrongs that they're done and that they're committing, and because of the great wide expanses of WA, it's harder for us to come together as a collective First Nations people, and march and protest and do all of those different democratic processes that bring about recognition of wrongs. So we do what we need to do, as everybody does, every First Nations individual, male or female, children, youth, do within their communities. We stand for our the wrongs that are happening in our community. And one of the wrongs that I know and grew up with, and traumas that I grew up with, was intergenerational violence. And everywhere in the southwest of Western Australia, everywhere I went, there was the three common denominators, which was alcohol, drugs, and violence. And I can remember that as far back as go back as far as I can remember, and that's probably my first memories are of my mum and dad and there being violence in the family. And then myself at that particular age, doing interventions with my parents, caregiver with my siblings. So you're practically, I was an invisible child. Like all children that go through that still today become invisible. And my siblings too residually impacted by it, and not as much as the direct impact that I've experienced. Because what it is when you do an intervention is you're directly involved. And depending on in my case, it happened regularly. And the more regular it was, the more normal it became, and the more invisible you became. And that is what led me to really founding the Aboriginal Males Healing Centre, Strong Spirit, Strong Family, Strong Culture. And it's because our aim is twofold, to reduce the homelessness of women and children, and the need for them to leave the home and seek refuge in women's shelters. And the second component of that is to remove the male and have a facility where the male is subject to being delivered obligatory to the healing centre, as opposed to being incarcerated. So there's actually three components in there. The reduction of the high incarceration rate for Aboriginal men as well that commit family violence. It's a vicious cycle in that respects. For women in particular, women when they are forced to leave their home, they're re-victimised over and over and over and over again. And the when the males, when the police do an intervention or get a call out for an incident, the only one of the only main options in their armoury for family and domestic violence, particularly the offender, is a violence restraining order. They call a violence restraining order here in West Australia. And it's really just a piece of paper. And what happens, of course, is it doesn't physically provide any preventative methodologies or opportunities for the offender or the police or the victim. So the only physical detainment process, of course, as we know, is if the offender is has arrest warrants out for him, and then it's a case of him that being discovered, and then he can be detained. So it's all about timing as well with regards to family violence. It's an incident that has a bearing on more than just the offender, the victim, the children as victims, family, neighbours, the person down the street, the bystander. There's so many people involved in a particular incident and witnessing whatever is occurring in that instance. Intervention-wise too, there's limited, intervention training out there as well in the community, and on how to do an intervention in that instance is practically just left to the professionals, which is fine in one respects. But it's quite a dangerous, and has been a dangerous precedent Australia-wide, because ultimately women and children end up homicide. So yeah, look, it's not just family violence doesn't discriminate. It's an insidious sickness. Men, we're not born violent, and we learn violence, and that's where I'm the son of a father. He was the son of a father, and that's 3 generations, including myself, that used violence. And what we had in 3 generations was there were nowhere to go to feel safe, and each and every generation was reminded constantly of the powerlessness that we have as Aboriginal men in opposing the forces of colonisation, and how inhibited we are about doing much about that occupation in our homelands. The patriarchal structures that Aboriginal men, as Aboriginal men, First Nations men, exist under, is oppressive, and then we have a gender biased structure that as Aboriginal men that is oppressive as well for us. And it leaves us very little to malleably work with on a masculinity, and a masculine identity. And I have always envisaged my masculine identity to be, half my mum, half my dad, half my grandmother, half my grandfather, so forth and so on. And I'm as half woman as I am half man. And we would have been pre-colonisation, given that opportunity to explore that. Of course, today there's not much room for exploration in that space at all. There's so much discrimination and vilification that exists on every level. The first level, of course, is being who your identity is, and that's an Indigenous male. And we struggle with the racial vilification with regards to that on a daily basis. All of our society as males is violent. You have the male-on-male violence, which is resoundingly oppressive. All the sports that we that we have in the patriarchal structures are violent sports. Everything's around that power and control model in society under patriarchalism. So we lack a voice around that, and that is just as violent as as physical violence is when you lack a voice in this space. So I am, like many others that are around Australia, and in limited numbers that we are, very small numbers that we are that voice, and saying, yeah, look, we aren't perfect. We are who we are. We don't lay blame on that, but we've been colonised, and due to that colonisation and the violence of that colonisation, I mean, in any colonial worldview, it's always take the male out first. And you take that male out, in the most violent way possible, and that includes, through the use of weapons and processes like institutionalisation, and the rape and murder of massacres of our women and children. And that's happened over the generations, continues to happen in today's world, really, in a way that it's difficult to fight back against, which leads to alcoholism and drug misuse and abuse, etc., etc., etc.
And tell me, Devon, the centre, what happens, like the process? Let's perhaps explore that. So you get the call from the police. Can men also self-refer themselves to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we say the term obligatory because without without desensitising, as we are already desensitised because of violence. We don't want to desensitise further, you know, around the wrongfulness of a man in abusing, or anybody abusing another person. And in this instance, the male abusing his partner. So we just apply the same process in that regards to the obligatory process, because we are used to being institutionalized. And we're well versed in listening to the number one authority in the police force, you know, in doing what needs to be done and doing as what we're told to do. So not moving away from that too far at all. That's why the obligation is for them to come. It's not an easy task or process for an individual to admit, or a male or female or anybody really, to admit that they use violence at all. You know, to self-volunteer and put their hand up, you know, yes, I do this, I've done that, I don't want to do that. You know, it's the same outlook, I suppose, as alcohol. And an alcoholic, and they have they're regularly, before people need to do an intervention, in denial. So a lot of perpetrators are truly versed in denial, and it's a that's my son. That's our son. He keeps walking by. He's home for holidays over here, so sorry for that interruption.
No, that's lovely. That's fine.
So yeah, look, the self-referrals are always there, but you'll find with men that use violence, and the reason why I say men that use violence is because we're very careful with our language as well. And we don't like to use the term, as an example, perpetrator. Saying that to an Aboriginal male is inciting, an inciting word, and of course we don't want to incite the person, the participant anymore at that point in time, of course, naturally. So we use words that are soft words rather than the harsh words that are introduced words. Colonisation, simply. So we use First Nations words that are soft, appropriate, and relevant. So the participant can self-refer to the centre, be referred to the centre, but mainly our main emphasis and mandate is right at the point of an incident where the police are called. The incident is occurring, has begun, and is in the middle of, or towards the end of, or at the beginning of. At the beginning of is you know, better. In the middle of is good. At the end of is it's not so good, because the damage is done, in that sense. And I mean the damage in that the abuse has occurred too long, over you know, too often over a longer period, and of course that permeates the intergenerational violence for the victim, and the children who are the victims, also the silent victims. And if they're males, those children are males, then it's obvious that they're being desensitized, and violence is becoming normalized. So they grow up doing exactly what their dad's done, and you imagine if you can just visualize our communities where a significant amount of our men in one family are using violence, and what then the next generation of boys are growing up into, and then the girls as well, because don't forget they're being desensitized and against violence. So it's normal for them to pick a male partner in their life that's violent, if they're choosing partners. Same for the men. You know, they go in with no idea until they, like me, first discovered that I was exactly like my father and exactly like my grandfather. Prior to that, I had every thought bubble in my body and every being and fibre of my body never to be like that, and it wasn't to be, unfortunately, and regrettably.
And the journey for somebody who enters, what does healing entail?
Well, that's a good question, Rick, because, you know, how do we heal? In general, how do we heal? You know, in our communities and in society. So we have healers, I suppose. You know, healers and the lived experience. In our case, and in any case, I strongly believe that where there's services such as ours, working with men that use violence, that you would be more inclined, as we are, to employ men that have a lived experience. Because that lived experience, you know, you're able to, as the participant is able to as well, is trust that lived experience. It's not learned through an institution. You know, in that respect, he can learn one aspect of being a counsellor, a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, but he could never have, if he's fortunate enough, or they are fortunate enough, to have not lived in a violent family setting, or community setting even as well. I mean, it happens all around you. The violence is not just in the home; it's in the community. Then the lived experience is the best outcome in our instance. We look at our participants as needing healing, but we look at them as a resource as well. You know, they're an asset, and to themselves, to their families, but they're an asset, you know, to us as well, because of their lived experience. And we want to harness that lived experience. So what we do is an incentive throughout their healing process, throughout the healing program, which, by the way, is 12 months. So longevity is the key. It's not a 16-week, 12-week, it's not a weekly program or a 6-monthly program. It's a 12-month program with a further 4-year care plan.
Wow.
So that's the total investment in that one individual, is 5-year investment that we need to it's necessary to do that, because we're working with men that use violence that have lived it all their life. And you cannot reverse a behaviour in so many weeks. You can only reverse a learned behaviour, and particularly a normalised behaviour in our communities, over introducing, you know, a healing that includes longevity. It's like the treatment of cancer. And you're always going to have that, you know, that likelihood of remission. You know, he's always going to have that likelihood of regressing, similar to an alcoholic. He's an alcoholic, or a person who has alcohol issues is only an arm's length away, from picking up any alcohol beverage and becoming his worst night or their worst nightmare again, and everybody else's. So it's similar. It's exactly the same outlook on the participant who uses violence, the male that uses violence. Unfortunately, due to the zero tolerance, which is absolutely valid, the zero tolerance. However, it's a funny zero tolerance, because, and it's, you can have violent sports, UFC, boxing, or because it's regulated and what have you, it's okay. And it only sends a deeper message, particularly around, masculinity, that, we're dispensable as men. Armies, even the concept of armies is a violent concept. Why do we need armies? We need armies because there's other violent people in the world that are going to attack us. So you think, oh, okay, and again, there you go. So that's why I say the community around, where I am, colonisation is 100 years in its infancy where I am now. And the reason being for that is because they only discovered iron ore here 100 years ago. And en masse now, the colonisers come into this country. So the traditional owners of the land here, more towards the desert regions too, practice their culture that they have always practiced since the beginning of time. So we have punishment, spearing, beatings. So they are, those concepts are concepts of violence in mainstream Australia, and they constitute violence under each and every criminal code in Australia as well. However, they find, and Aboriginal people in this space too find, which is quite a conundrum, find a peace with that, which I don't personally myself. I believe we need to, as men and as communities, be discussing that. Women and women and men's business is so inhibiting. It shuts conversations down, relevant conversations. It's quite it can be a tactic that can be quite violent. We could be protecting sexual abusers. In communities, can be protecting violent abusers, because they're leaders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's man's business. Men need to take care of that, women will say. And then when they come to the leader, the man will say to the woman, oh, that's woman's business, you'll have to deal with that. You see, so that's a conundrum.
Yeah, and I was going to say that real binary segregation of roles really creates sometimes, as you're saying, problematic.
Well, very problematic.
For the male.
Yeah.
Where he's brought up to feel a certain way, act a certain way.
Correct.
And perhaps with the emotions sort of bury them.
Correct.
So, and I can see, so with the healing program, how does the awareness develop that change needs to come from within? Is that something that takes time for different men?
Yes, it does. It absolutely it does. I mean, my healing journey was my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an overnight. It's not an overnight thing. It's not about a perpetrator. I'll use that word now. It's not about a male that uses violence, just wakes up one day and said, I've done the wrong thing for the last 2 years in my relationship. I need to change my behaviours. That's the going concept in mainstream Australia.
Mm.
And let's back it up with a few programs here and there on behaviour issues. And she'd be right, mate. You know, it's like chuck a chop and a sausage and a shrimp on the barbie and everything's good.
Mm.
You've got to. It's a minefield. Their society is a minefield of not ignoring, but it's a minefield of potential violent triggers out there. Every year, grand final season, for example, your heart's on your sleeve for your team. They lose the grand final. Up goes the rate of violence in the community. They know this, but do they stop the sports? And no, there's too much money involved in that. You know, there's too much employment, all of those things involved in a sporting game, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Too much enjoyment for people to sit around the idiot box and watch if they're not at the game live. So the only thing they offer for the perpetrator, quite frankly, is a punitive process. And that's not fair for Aboriginal men, because colonisation is our punitive process. And it's a double jeopardy for us in that sense. Every time I'd done what I'd done, I would go through the motions of being that offender. As a result, my relationships were very limited with the opposite sex. That very limited, because I didn't trust myself.
Mm-hmm.
And when those relationships came about were under the influence, of drug and alcohol. And then you were just more or less trapped and used of being in a relationship and the way it was going. The other person, the opposite sexual partner, was also in that context, as exact same. Drug abuse, misuse. The victim knew, they were victims from another previous relationship. In their family, they were normalised because of violence. That's how the process goes. You may have been lucky sometimes to have met I was once where I met, but the woman, the partner, the female in this instance, was non-Indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no normalisation of violence in her life. It was so new to her when I did what I did to her. Then that she became, what would I say? What's that nurse? They what's the name in the Gadia world? Florence Nightingale.
Oh yes. She wanted to save you.
Yeah, became a Florence Nightingale on me, and okay, but on this, I'm not. You can't fix me. That's the belief you have, as a male, you believe that you can't be, there's nothing that can fix you. All the programs you go to, they use one model. The model is the Duluth Model, right, in mainstream society. That Duluth Model is an American model that comes out of Duluth, a town called Duluth in Wisconsin, USA. And that model is based on the wheels, the many wheels of power and control. And when you're an individual participant as an offender in those programs, you're like this black speck on a white wall. That's the group therapy that you're in. And then when you're having this therapy, they're giving and looking at you with a white worldview, not a black worldview. And you're being castigated with that white worldview of having your own black worldview. You know, like, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, you've made your point about the wrongs of what this is. What about the wrongs that began 250 years ago on the Eastern Seaboard, down in my country 230 years ago, 30, 40 years ago? What about those wrongs? What about the massacres, etc.? Oh no, we can't do anything about that. But that is the trauma that is seeping out of the pores of your skin, really. When you are, being the offender in a relationship, being the participant in a behavioural change program. Even the word men's behaviour change program is mainstream. We steer away from the term of men's behaviour change program, because it's like it's labelling.
Absolutely.
What do you mean I've got a behaviour? So and the level of understanding of Aboriginals' worldviews, of understanding mainstream worldviews, is they look at that and go, what do you mean my behaviour? You mean all my behaviours? What behaviour are you talking about? Is it that behaviour? Is it this behaviour? All those different things. I mean, it's not just the one thing, because in Aboriginal communities, everything is multifaceted. Everything is multifaceted. It's not just one worldview, just blinkers. It's like peripheral vision like that. And, they use, like I said, well, okay, you can heal me in this session, right? What do I do about my uncle or my dad when I go out from here and he's doing the same thing? Do I hide myself, or do I escape that reality by finding a deserted island? How do I escape those things? So they give you, they don't have the appropriate cultural, authentic response in that respect. They have the obvious, well, he needs help. Well, you don't say, of course I need help. But then you're going back into your own community, then taking on that Florence Nightingale process again. As come on, Dad, come with me. And he's your senior, and he's telling you, turn around and say, piss off. What are you talking about? You don't even know what you're talking about, boy. Yeah, would you do that? You said, no, I don't. So he's in denial. And that's the first thing you're learning, is how to deny as well. So within mindfulness, we use a lot of mindfulness in our healing programs. One of the biggest mindful processes we use is silence. We let the participant just sit there, be silent. They know that because we've created an environment. So in that environment, he knows what he's there for. He knows what it is that we're delivering there. So we don't force feed him though. We just allow him to attend whatever session there is, therapeutic, one-on-one group sessions. We let them own their healing pathways. And if they want to own that by absconding and not doing anything about it, then the first thing we have in our armoury is that we're a part of a bigger safety plan for the victims, and that we've got our eyes on him.
Mm-hmm.
Because when nobody's got the eyes on the offender, particularly after an incident, he's just free to walk away into the sunset. And nobody knows where he is.
Mm.
Only the victim knows where he is when he turns up on her doorstep with the intent to harm, maim, or kill.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
So what we want to be in that intervention process with the centre, the healing centre, in that space, in that facility, in that safe space for the male. If he's safe, everybody else is safe. That's the outlook that we have. If he's safe, then everybody's safe, including the police. You know, the police can pull their gun and shoot him.
Mm.
You know, and then he's got that in his life, that individual. The woman, you know, the latest one, I suppose it's what we're trying to prevent as well is the extremities of the extreme violent act that happens in mainstream Australia. Right? It's happened in Queensland on recent times, where women and children are burned alive.
Mm.
Okay, in their vehicle, stalking, coercive control. Now you consider this, Rick. They left that male in the home, right? And the woman was forced to flee because there were no protections in place, no interventions, no flags, nothing in place to protect her. She has to leave to seek safety.
Mm.
He gets to remain in the home. It no longer is a home from that point on. It becomes a shrine. And then once everything else fails of her coming back, the pleading, the begging, the coercive control, you know, the methods that he applies to get her back, it then becomes, the home becomes a memorial for him. And that's why he reaches that snapping point where he's going to do what he's going to do. Once that home is a memorial, not coming back, the children not coming back, he will do then what he has to do, which is the outcome, what we see regularly in communities. Simply because they didn't remove him from the home. They allowed that individual, that sick individual in the head, to actually immortalise, you know, what he believed he owned. And one of those immortalisations was he worked hard under a patriarchal structure. Now, I provided all this. I bust my ass to put this food on the table, to buy that house, to pay that mortgage, to put that car there, to buy that toy there, those things. Those menial things to an outsider, but to someone like me, that's lived experience, I see the triggers everywhere. Mm. And that's the saddest thing, is that society would rather, you know, I meet a lot of resistance in this space because most of society doesn't know what a reformed perpetrator looks like. Yet we're so geared in our social welfare structure to have that outcome. Yet we don't know what one looks like. It just baffles me. Does that make sense?
Oh, I think what you've provided our audience is a real deep insight into really deep reflective psyche, you know, of the Indigenous male and the impact of colonialisation, as well as over the trauma of the child over time, the experiences, and that deep sense of loss and trust that obviously that the centre that you've created is trying to rebuild and strengthen over time through the use of traditional healing methods. And for that, we thank you. And just to sum up now, if people would like to help in some way who are listening, how can they get in touch with you and your centre?
Yeah, look, we have thanks, Rick. Yeah, sorry about that. I was a bit rude there. I came in a bit early. www.amhc.org.au. It's our website.
Fabulous. And we'll put a link also onto this if anyone would like to donate and support the organisation with resources, because obviously that's what's needed to keep it going, especially the fact that it's a long-term program, for long-term outcomes. And if people want to do something that really is worthwhile, that works, that's driven from community for community, I think it's a wonderful idea that as little as much you can give will help go a long way. And, we thank you for that hard work, and we look forward again to speaking with you again, because obviously this is just the start of the conversation. And I think it's important that we hear more, Devon, about the experiences and further on. It'd be great to have a further discussion again about trust in terms of what you feel are some of the issues around building relationships from men with men.
Yes.
And being comfortable with that, which I think is an important area to explore, so that young Indigenous men listening, and also people working in communities or wanting to understand from the perspective, from an Indigenous lens, about Indigenous life, to stop reading books written by white privileged professionals who have very little experience about working. And one of my premises is from the community development model that power resonates from within, and power within the self is strength. Thank you so much, Devon, for today. And may you have a beautiful day, and your family are safe.
Thank you, Cobber, and may your campfires burn forever.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll just stop that.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Rick.
Bye.